Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest open, palms up or palms down, whichever feels more like surrender. You don't need to concentrate. You don't need to memorize anything. The story you are about to hear has already been written into your body. It lives in your cells right now, waiting to be read. All you need to do is breathe. Breathe in and out. Good. Let's begin. Your family tree has a secret, not a small one. For most of human history, for all of recorded civilization, for every story ever told around a fire, for every religion and every philosophy, and every legal system ever written, we believed our story was simple. Clean, triumphant. Modern humans evolved in Africa. We spread across the world. We replaced everyone else who came before us. We stood alone at the summit of creation, the last and only kind of human mind on this planet. That story is dead. In the last 15 years, a revolution in ancient DNA technology has torn that narrative apart. What science has found underneath, beneath the clean lines and the comfortable story we told ourselves, is something far stranger, far darker, and far more interesting than anything we imagined. 100,000 years ago, at least 9 species of human beings shared this planet. 9. They walked on 2 legs. They used tools. Some of them buried their dead. Some of them made art in the darkness of caves where no one would ever see it. They loved, in whatever way love was possible for a mind like theirs. They grieved. They planned. They survived winters that would kill most of us within days. They were not animals. They were not monsters. They were not us, but they were not so far from us either. And then, one by one, they were gone. Or so we thought. The truth that genetics has only recently been able to show us, is that they did not simply disappear. They were absorbed. Their genes traveled forward in time, inside the bodies of our ancestors, and then inside our own. Right now, as you lie here in the quiet dark, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to drift, some of what makes you who you are, some small and ancient part of your immune system, some thread of your neurological wiring, came not from Homo sapiens, but from beings who walked this earth hundreds of thousands of years before anyone called it a name. They are gone as populations. They are gone as cultures. Their languages are lost. Their songs are lost. The things they believed about the stars are lost. But they are still here, in the most literal biological sense possible. They live inside you. Tonight, we are going to tell their story, all of them. We are going to walk through deep time together, through ice ages and volcanic winters, and the long twilight of species that survived for 1,000,000 years before quietly fading from the fossil record. We are going to meet the beings who shared our world and shaped our bodies, even as we forgot they ever existed. It is a story worth knowing. It is, in the most precise sense, your story. Close your eyes. Let's go back. Summer, 1856. It was an unremarkable summer morning in the Neander Valley, a narrow limestone gorge near the city of Dusseldorf in western Germany. Quarry workers were doing what quarry workers do, blasting and chipping and hauling stone, when their tools broke into a small cave about 60 meters above the valley floor. Inside, they found bones. They almost threw them away. The foreman thought they were the remains of a cave bear. The limestone was valuable, the bones were not. But one of the workers gathered them up, a skull cap, curved and strangely flattened, with a massive brow ridge projecting forward like the brim of a hat, some arm bones, unusually thick, a few ribs, parts of a pelvis, and brought them to a local schoolteacher named Johann Karl Fuhlrott. Fuhlrott looked at the skull cap for a long time. It was not a bear. It was not any animal he had ever seen described. The brow ridge was too prominent, too deliberate, too clearly belonging to a face. But it was not the face of any human being he recognized from anatomy books. It was long and low where a human skull is rounded. It was thick where a human skull is rounded. The eye sockets beneath that shelf of bone would have been large and deep-set in a way that seemed, to Fuhlrott's eye, almost ancient. He brought the bones to Hermann Schaffhausen, a professor of anatomy at the University of Bonn. Together, in 1857, 2 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species, they presented their findings to the scientific community of Europe. Here, they said, is evidence of a being that once lived in this valley, a being that was not quite human, as we know human, a being that may have been here before us. The reaction was not wonder, it was hostility. The most powerful pathologist in Germany, a man named Rudolf Virchow, whose word carried more scientific authority than almost anyone else in Europe, examined the bones and delivered his verdict with full confidence. The individual had been a modern human being who suffered from rickets in childhood, arthritis in adulthood, and had received severe blows to the head that deformed the skull. The features were pathological. The creature was simply a diseased man, probably a Cossack soldier from Napoleon's retreat, probably a hermit who had crawled into the cave to die. The scientific establishment largely agreed with him. For decades. What is remarkable about this episode is not that Virchow was wrong. Scientists are wrong constantly. That is how science works. What is remarkable is how desperately everyone wanted him to be right. The idea that another kind of human being had once walked through this valley, that we were not alone, that we had never been the only kind of human mind on Earth. This was not merely scientifically inconvenient. It was philosophically threatening. We needed to be unique. We needed to be the only ones. That need shaped how every fossil was interpreted for the next century and a half. It shaped the questions scientists thought to ask. It shaped the stories that got told in textbooks and natural history museums. The story of human prehistory was told as a story of ascent. One kind of creature giving rise to another, slightly better creature, until finally, triumphantly, us, Homo sapiens, the top of the ladder, the pinnacle of evolution. It was a comforting story. It was also, almost entirely, wrong. Let your body settle into that understanding. The story you were told was wrong, not maliciously, simply wrong, the way stories often are when we want them to be tidy and they refuse to cooperate. Take a slow breath, and let's meet who was actually out there. What the bones eventually told us. By the early 20th century, the weight of evidence had become impossible to dismiss. Neanderthal bones had been found across Europe, in France, in Belgium, in Croatia, in Gibraltar. Not one diseased individual, not a hermit, not a Cossack, a species, a population that had spread across an entire continent and persisted for 300,000 years. Their brains, it turned out, were on average slightly larger than ours, not smaller, larger. That single fact alone should have been enough to unsettle every assumption that had been made about them. The old image, the shambling, knuckle-dragging brute with a guttural grunt instead of language, had taken root too deeply in the popular imagination. It was too convenient. It made our ascent look inevitable, our dominance look earned, our solitude look natural. But the bones kept disagreeing, and eventually, science had to listen. The Altai Mountains, 2008. There is a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, at an altitude where the air is thin and the winters are long, and the silence between one human being and the next could easily stretch for days. It is called Denisova Cave, named for a hermit who allegedly lived there in the 18th century. Long before that hermit arrived, the cave had other residents. Many kinds of residents, over many thousands of years. In 2008, archaeologists excavating a layer of sediment deep in the cave found a small piece of bone, very small, a fragment of the terminal phalanx, the outermost bone of a little finger, the small knobbed piece at the very tip. Based on its size, it had belonged to a child, perhaps 5 to 7 years old. The fragment was too fragmentary for any meaningful anatomical analysis. In previous decades, it would have been catalogued, boxed, labeled, and largely forgotten. But this was 2008, and a Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo had spent most of his adult life developing techniques for reading ancient DNA from material tens of thousands of years old. The fingertip bone was sent to Pääbo's laboratory at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. His team extracted the mitochondrial DNA from that fragment of a child's finger. What they found stopped the entire field of paleoanthropology in its tracks. The sequence did not match Homo sapiens. They had anticipated finding Neanderthal DNA. The cave contained evidence of ancient human occupation, and Neanderthal populations had lived throughout this region for hundreds of thousands of years. It did not match Neanderthal either. It was something else entirely, a third lineage. A population of human beings, completely unknown to science, never seen in the fossil record, never suspected, invisible to 1.5 centuries of paleoanthropological research, because the bones they left behind looked to the naked eye like the bones of other archaic human species, and no one had had the technology to look deeper until now. They named them Denisovans after the cave. At the time of the announcement in 2010, the entire physical evidence for this new species of human beings consisted of one fingertip bone and, subsequently, one tooth. That was all. One fingertip, one molar, and an entire species. This was not how paleontology was supposed to work. For 150 years, the discovery of ancient human species had depended on bones, on the painstaking physical comparison of skulls and jaws and brow ridges. The Denisovans had no morphology. They were pure chemistry, pure information, encoded in the double helix of ancient DNA recovered from a child's fingertip. It was as if someone had found a ghost, and instead of photographing it, had managed to sequence its genome. Svante Pääbo would receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for this work. When the Nobel Committee announced the prize, they said his findings provided the foundation for understanding what makes us uniquely human, not the foundation for understanding a new species, the foundation for understanding ourselves. The ghost across a continent. When Pääbo's team completed their analysis of the Denisovan genome, they discovered something the physical evidence alone could never have revealed. The Denisovans were not a regional population. They were a distinct lineage that had separated from the Neanderthal branch of the human family tree approximately 400,000 years ago, and had subsequently spread across an enormous geographic range, from the cold mountains of Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. How do we know this without finding their bones across that range? Because they left their DNA in the people who live there today. The Denisovan genetic signal is found at highest concentrations in Melanesian populations, the indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea and the surrounding islands, where it accounts for approximately 4 to 6% of the genome. It is found at lower but still significant levels in Aboriginal Australians, in Polynesian populations, in some Southeast Asian populations, and in the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This distribution tells a story. When our ancestors arrived from Africa and moved eastward and southward through Asia, they encountered Denisovans repeatedly. They interbred repeatedly, and the genetic signature of those encounters traveled forward in time, all the way to the present moment, where it lives in the genomes of tens of millions of living human beings. In 2019, a fragment of jawbone was identified in a museum collection in China. It had been found by a Buddhist monk on a riverbed in Tibet in 1980 and had been held in a university repository for decades without anyone understanding what it was. When researchers applied protein analysis, the jaw turned out to be Denisovan. It had been found at an altitude of 3,400 meters. It was dated to at least 160,000 years old. The Denisovans were living at high altitude on the roof of the world 160,000 years ago, and the genetic variant that allows modern Tibetans to live and function at extreme altitude, a variant of the gene EPAS1 that prevents the dangerous overproduction of red blood cells, is a Denisovan variant. Tibetans got their high-altitude adaptation from Denisovans. The people who first lived on the roof of the world gave their successors the biological toolkit to survive there. Not through teaching, not through culture, through DNA, through the quiet inheritance of a genome passed down across tens of thousands of years. That is not replacement. That is inheritance. Unlearning the brute. For most of the 20th century, the Neanderthal occupied a very specific role in the human imagination. They were the cautionary tale, the also-rans, the evolutionary dead end that proved, by contrast, how extraordinary Homo sapiens was. They were depicted as shambling, brutal, barely articulate, creatures who dragged their knuckles across cave floors and grunted at each other in the dark, driven by instinct and appetite and nothing more. That image is not merely incomplete, it is almost the precise opposite of what the evidence shows. Let us take that image and set it aside, gently, the way you set down a book that has been useful but is no longer true. And let us look at what we actually know. The man in Shanidar Cave. In 1953, archaeologists excavating Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraqi Kurdistan found the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals who had been deliberately placed in the cave over a period stretching from roughly 65,000 to 35,000 years ago. One of these individuals, known to researchers as Shanidar I, told a story that stopped everyone who heard it. He had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his skull that had left him blind in his left eye. His right arm had been so severely damaged, probably from birth or early childhood, that it had withered and was essentially absent. He had a healed fracture of his right leg. His skeleton showed the kind of damage that, in a world of subsistence hunters and foragers, should have been a death sentence many times over. And yet, he lived to be between 40 and 50 years old. In a world where survival depended entirely on physical capability, on hunting, on foraging, on constant physical activity in terrain that was cold and unforgiving, this man survived for decades with one eye, no usable right arm, and a damaged leg. He could only have survived if others fed him, if others cared for him, if others made deliberate decisions over years to sustain a member of the group who could contribute almost nothing to the group's physical survival. That is not the behavior of a brute. That is not the behavior of a creature driven purely by instinct and immediate need. That is the behavior of a social being capable of something that we might, without too much hesitation, call compassion. Let that word sit with you for a moment. Compassion, one of the most distinctly human qualities we claim for ourselves. And here it is, preserved in bone, in a cave in the Zagros Mountains, 40,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in that part of the world. The flowers and the ochre and the eagles, the archaeologist, Ralph Solecki, who excavated Shanidar Cave, reported that soil samples taken from around another of the burials, Shanidar 4, contained large concentrations of pollen from 8 plant species, several of which have medicinal properties, and most of which bloom in spring. He interpreted this as evidence that the body had been buried with flowers. This interpretation has been challenged. The pollen may have been introduced by burrowing rodents, and the debate continues among specialists. But even without the flowers, the broader picture of Neanderthal behavior, assembled from sites across Europe and Western Asia, is striking. Neanderthals buried their dead, not all of them, and the burials were not always elaborate. But the deliberate interment of bodies is well documented at multiple sites: La Chapelle aux Saints in France, Kebara Cave in Israel, Amud Cave in Israel. The practice of burial implies, at minimum, an awareness of death as a distinct state, and quite possibly something that functions like grief, like ritual, like the impulse to say, "This person mattered." Neanderthals made and used ochre, the red iron oxide pigment, which they appear to have applied to their bodies and possibly to objects. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, perforated marine shells that appear to have been used as personal ornaments, colored with pigment, have been dated to 115,000 years ago. Homo sapiens had not yet arrived in Europe. These were Neanderthal ornaments. In 2012, a study published in Science reported the discovery of eagle talons at a Neanderthal site in Croatia, dated to 130,000 years ago, 80,000 years before modern humans arrived in Europe. The talons showed cut marks consistent with the removal of feathers, and wear patterns consistent with having been strung together as jewelry. Eagles are not good eating. Their talons have no practical utility. The Neanderthals were collecting them for reasons that can only be described as aesthetic or symbolic, or both. They wanted to be adorned. They wanted to carry something beautiful. That impulse toward the beautiful, toward the symbolic, toward the object that means something more than its physical function, is not something we invented. We inherited it. Or we reinvented it independently, walking the same path toward symbolic thought that our Neanderthal cousins had already begun to walk. Art made in the dark, In 2018, a team of researchers published uranium-thorium dating results for cave art in 3 Spanish caves: La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales. The dates for some of the art were 65,000 years old, more than 20,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. The art, hand stencils, geometric shapes, lines made by blowing pigment through tubes or pressing hands against stone, had to have been made by Neanderthals. There was simply no one else there. They were making art, in the darkness underground, creating images that no one on the surface world would ever see. Pressing their hands against cold stone in a cave chamber that was already hundreds of thousands of years old and leaving their mark. That is not a survival behavior. That requires planning, gathering pigment, preparing it, carrying it deep into a cave, applying it with intention. That requires a relationship to the visual world that implies, at minimum, a symbolic mind. A mind that understood that an image can mean something, that a mark can say something, that there is value in making something that does not feed you, does not shelter you, does not protect you from predators, but which somehow, in a way that defies practical explanation, matters. They were doing what we do. They were making art because they had to. Because the impulse to leave a mark, to say I was here, to translate inner experience into an outer form, that impulse does not belong to Homo sapiens alone. It may belong to anyone who thinks deeply enough to feel the weight of existence. Rest in that thought. The oldest known cave art in Europe was made by hands that were not quite like yours, broader, thicker-fingered, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in cold climates. But they pressed against stone for the same reason your hands have ever made anything, because they were here, and they needed the world to know it. Why did they disappear? 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone. After 300,000 years of successful habitation across Europe and Western Asia, they vanished from the fossil record within a few thousand years of the arrival of Homo sapiens. 3 explanations dominate the current scientific discussion, and none of them is simple. The first is competition. Homo sapiens may have outcompeted Neanderthals for resources, not necessarily through violence, though violence almost certainly occurred at some points, but through superior efficiency in hunting, in food storage, in social networking across larger groups that allowed for better information sharing. A small competitive advantage, maintained consistently over thousands of years, is sufficient to drive a population to extinction without any direct conflict at all. The second is disease. When Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, they brought pathogens from Africa and from the long journey through the Middle East, diseases to which Neanderthals had never been exposed, against which they had no immune defenses. A disease to which one population is immune and another is not can eliminate 90% of the vulnerable population within a single generation. The third explanation, and the one that modern genetics has made increasingly compelling, is not replacement at all. It is absorption. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals met in Europe and the Middle East, they did not simply compete, they interbred. The evidence for this is now unambiguous and irreversible. Every person alive today who is not of purely sub-Saharan African ancestry carries between 1.8 and 2.6% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. That DNA has been there for between 50,000 and 60,000 years. It was incorporated when our ancestors met and mated with Neanderthals as they moved out of Africa and through the Middle East into Europe and Asia. 2% sounds small. It is not small. Across the entire population of humans outside sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 6 billion people, the total amount of Neanderthal DNA preserved in living human genomes is estimated to exceed the total amount that would have been in the entire Neanderthal population at its peak. More Neanderthal DNA exists today, distributed across the genomes of living humans, than existed when Neanderthals were alive. They did not disappear. They were diluted, distributed, and some of what they gave us, we still carry and still use. We also kept some of the less useful parts. Neanderthal genetic variants have been associated with increased risk of depression, with blood clotting disorders, and, in a finding that acquired sudden relevance in 2020, with increased severity of COVID-19 infection. A stretch of Neanderthal DNA on chromosome 3 appears to roughly double the risk of requiring respiratory support in severe COVID cases. The Neanderthals have been gone for 40,000 years, and they are still affecting how we die. Breathe with that for a moment. Let it move through you like the slow tide. Denny. In 2018, Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute published the analysis of a bone fragment found in Denisova Cave, a fragment large enough to suggest it came from an individual who was at least 13 years old at time of death. The genomic analysis was unprecedented. Roughly 38 to 42% of this individual's DNA came from a Neanderthal mother. The remaining DNA was Denisovan, from a Denisovan father. She was the direct offspring of a Neanderthal and a Denisovan, not a population with mixed ancestry accumulated over generations. An individual, a child, a girl the researchers would come to call Denny, whose parents were two different species of human being. Denny's mother, based on the specific Neanderthal genetic sequence she carried, came from a population genetically related to Neanderthals found in Western Europe, thousands of kilometers from Denisova Cave in Siberia, which means Denny's mother, or her recent ancestors, had traveled an enormous distance across Eurasia before meeting Denny's Denisovan father in or near that cave. Two populations that had been evolutionarily separate for 400,000 years, that had diverged so long ago that they were classified as different species, met in a cave in the Siberian mountains, and a child was born. And that child was real. She had a mother. She had a father. She breathed the cold mountain air and looked up at the same stars that still hang above that valley today. She was not a statistic, or a data point, or a proof of concept. She was a person who existed at the crossroads of two worlds. We will never know her name. We will never know if she laughed. We will never know if she was loved. But we know she existed, because a fragment of her bone survived in a cave for tens of thousands of years. And the information encoded in that fragment was precise enough to tell us who her parents were. Denny. We are not a species that replaced others. We are a species that absorbed others, that carried their genetic legacy inside our own bodies as we walked forward through time. What the DNA carries. Beyond immunity and altitude, the Neanderthal and Denisovan contributions to the modern human genome extend into territory that is only beginning to be mapped. In 2021, a research group at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden published a study examining a cluster of genes associated with pain sensitivity in modern humans. They found that a variant of the gene SCN9A, a gene that regulates sodium ion flow in neurons and plays a role in pain perception, is found in roughly 15% of people of Eurasian ancestry. The variant produces heightened pain sensitivity compared to the more common version. The variant is Neanderthal in origin. 15% of Eurasians feel pain differently because of Neanderthals, not differently in some abstract genetic statistics way. Differently in the most immediate, physical, present tense sense. When they cut a finger, or bruise a shin, or lie awake in the middle of the night with a muscle that won't stop aching. Some part of what they experience in that moment is a Neanderthal experience. A sensation calibrated by evolutionary pressures that operated on populations that lived and died 40,000 years ago in the cold forests of Ice Age Europe. They are gone. They have been gone for 40,000 years. Their populations are extinct. Their cultures are lost. Their languages, and the evidence of the hyoid bone found at Kibara strongly suggests they probably had language, are silent forever. And yet, in a hospital room, in a moment of physical suffering, something of them is still present, still feeling. The boundary between their world and ours is not where we thought it was. It is not 40,000 years ago. It is not drawn at any point in the past we can identify with precision. It runs through us, right now, in the present tense. Feel your own breathing. The rise and fall, the ancient mechanism of lungs and ribs and diaphragm, shaped by hundreds of millions of years of evolution, carrying the DNA of half a dozen human species in the cells that line every surface. You are not simple. You never were. The Hobbit of Flores. The island of Flores lies in the Indonesian archipelago, east of Java and west of Timor. It is a lush island of volcanic mountains and dense forest and rivers that run red with iron-rich soil. It is not the kind of place where you would expect to find one of the most surprising discoveries in the history of human evolution. In 2003, researchers excavating Liang Bua Cave on Flores found the skeleton of an adult female hominin that stood approximately 1 meter tall and had a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. She was given the species name Homo floresiensis. Informally, she was called the Hobbit. She was not alone. Remains of at least 9 individuals of the same species were eventually found in the cave. They had been living on Flores for at least 100,000 years before our ancestors arrived, and possibly for as long as 700,000 years. They made stone tools. They hunted the dwarf elephants that also lived on the island, using cooperative hunting strategies that required planning and communication. A creature with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's was hunting elephants with stone tools and coordinated strategy. This shattered one of the most fundamental assumptions in paleoanthropology, the assumption that brain size and cognitive capability are directly and simply related. Homo floresiensis, by all existing models, should not have been capable of the behavior the archaeological evidence showed it performing. The brain was too small. The model was wrong. The likely explanation involves island dwarfism, the well-documented tendency of large-bodied animals isolated on islands to evolve towards smaller body sizes over many generations. The Flores hominins appear to have descended from Homo erectus populations that crossed the water barrier to Flores at some point in the distant past, and had then undergone hundreds of thousands of years of island-driven miniaturization. The brain shrank. But the cognitive architecture necessary for complex behavior was apparently preserved in a reduced form that our metrics of brain volume had completely failed to predict. They survived on Flores until approximately 50,000 years ago. Somewhere on that island, in the forests around that cave, there was a last moment, a last hunting party, a last fire, a last night in a world that had been theirs for most of 1,000,000 years. The Shadow People of Luzon. The island of Luzon, in what is now the Philippines, tells a similar story, and a stranger one. In 2019, researchers announced the identification of a new hominin from Luzon based on fossils found in Calayo Cave. They named it Homo luzonensis. It was tiny, with unusual skeletal features, a combination of primitive and derived characteristics that had never been seen together in any known hominin. It was estimated to be between 50,000 and 67,000 years old. Not a regional variant of a known species, another branch of the human family tree entirely. We know almost nothing about Homo luzonensis. We have a few teeth, a few small bones. We cannot tell you what they ate, how they organized their social lives, whether they made art. We know only that they were there, and then they were not. Homo naledi and the problem of the brain. In 2013, recreational cavers exploring the Rising Star cave system in South Africa's Cradle of Humankind region discovered a passage so narrow that the researchers who would eventually excavate it had to be selected partly on their ability to fit through a squeeze of approximately 18 centimeters. Through that squeeze, along a passage that required experienced cavers with lights strapped to their heads, lay a chamber. The researchers called it the Dinaledi chamber. Inside, they found bones. Extraordinary numbers of bones, the remains of at least 15 individuals of a previously unknown species of hominin, Homo naledi, after the Sesotho word for star. Homo naledi was strange. Its brain was tiny, approximately 400 to 600 cubic centimeters, smaller than a chimpanzee's, and far smaller than any other known member of the genus Homo. Its body was small, roughly 1.5 meters tall. Its skull was primitive in ways that suggested, to trained eyes, that it should be very old, perhaps 2 to 3 million years old. The dating results, published in 2017, were one of the most startling findings in the history of paleoanthropology. Homo naledi was not 2 million years old. It was between 235,000 and 335,000 years old. This tiny-brained, primitive-looking creature was alive at the same time as Neanderthals, at the same time as early Homo sapiens, a species that in its physical characteristics appeared to belong to the dawn of the human genus, was somehow surviving in southern Africa on the same continent where our own species was evolving. And there is something else about the Dinaledi chamber that has not been resolved, and may never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. There are no signs of carnivore activity, no stone tools, no evidence of habitation, no evidence of an entrance other than the nearly impassable squeeze. The most parsimonious explanation for why the remains of 15 individuals are concentrated in a single, almost inaccessible, underground chamber is that they were put there deliberately. That Homo naledi, with its 400 cubic centimeter brain, was disposing of its dead in a specific location consistently over time. That would make Homo naledi's mortuary behavior as sophisticated as behaviors we have associated with species whose brains were 3 times larger. In 2023, what appear to be engravings on the cave walls were reported in the Dinaledi chamber. Geometric shapes, cross-hatched lines, made by Homo naledi. If confirmed, this would be the oldest known cave art in the world, made not by Homo sapiens and not by Neanderthals, but by a species with a brain smaller than many of our primate relatives. Everything we thought we knew about the relationship between brain size and symbolic thought is being challenged by a creature that lived in a cave in South Africa 300,000 years ago. Homo erectus, the great survivor. Before we move on, we must spend a moment with the species that, in many ways, deserves the most respect of all. Homo erectus appeared in Africa roughly 2 million years ago. It was the first hominin to leave Africa. By 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus populations had reached the Caucasus. By 1.6 million years ago, they were in Southeast Asia. They made fire. They made hand axes. A standardized tool technology so sophisticated and so consistent that the same basic tool form was produced across Africa, Europe, and Asia for over 1 million years. They persisted for an extraordinary duration. The last known populations on Java appear to have survived until approximately 117,000 years ago, meaning that Homo erectus overlapped in time with Homo sapiens, with Neanderthals, and possibly with Denisovans for hundreds of thousands of years. 2 million years of existence. For context, our own species, Homo sapiens, has been on this earth for at most 300,000 years. Homo erectus lasted nearly 7 times longer than we have so far managed. 7 times. Let that thought drift through you like distant thunder. The patience of deep time. 2 million years. Yunnan Province, China, 14,000 years ago. There is a cave in the Yunnan Province of southern China, near the city of Mengzi. It is called Maludong, Red Deer Cave, because its ancient inhabitants hunted the large red deer that roamed the surrounding forest, and the bones of those deer are still there, charred and cracked, preserved in the cave's sediment. In 1989, archaeologists found those bones, hundreds of them. The cave had clearly been used as a shelter, as a place where food was cooked and consumed. The hominin bones were mixed with charcoal. The deer bones had been cracked to extract the marrow. Whoever lived in Red Deer Cave used fire, processed their food, hunted large animals, and kept returning to the same place. All behaviors consistent with behaviorally modern humans. But the bones themselves were deeply strange. When researchers completed their analysis of the hominin remains in 2012, the picture that emerged refused to fit any known category. The skulls were thick-walled and heavily built, with prominent brow ridges and a steeply angled forehead. The brain case was smaller than modern humans and had a shape unlike anything in the modern human range of variation. The face was flat and broad. The chin was absent, a feature that in the fossil record is strongly associated with archaic rather than modern humans. In every physical feature, the Red Deer Cave people looked ancient, primitive, like something that should have been millions of years older. They had been alive in Yunnan Province between 11,500 and 14,500 years ago. Let that number settle. 14,000 years ago. 14,000 years ago, the pyramids of Egypt were still 4,000 years in the future. Agriculture had just been invented in the Fertile Crescent. Human civilization was already underway in parts of the world. And in a cave in southern China, a population of beings with skulls that looked like they belonged to a creature 500,000 years older was hunting red deer and cracking marrow bones by firelight. The researchers who published the analysis were careful. They acknowledged that the red deer cave people might represent a very early and very divergent population of Homo sapiens that had retained archaic features, isolated in the refugia of southern China long enough to become anatomically distinct. But they also acknowledged the alternative, that these were the last survivors of an archaic human lineage that had persisted in the deep forests and river valleys of southern China long after every other non-sapiens human population on Earth had disappeared. If that alternative is correct, if the red deer cave people were indeed a distinct archaic lineage, then the last non-Homo sapiens human beings on Earth were not the Neanderthals in Europe 40,000 years ago. They were not the Hobbits of Flores 50,000 years ago. They were a group of hunters in Yunnan province who were alive within human memory, within the time frame of oral tradition, within the period when the first cities were being built and the first writing systems were being developed on the other side of the Eurasian continent. They were there when the first farmers were planting the first crops in the Fertile Crescent. They were there when the first boats were crossing to Australia. They were there, possibly, when the first human beings were telling the first stories around fires on the other side of the world. And nobody knew, because nobody who left a written record ever saw them, or if they did not know what they were looking at. The encounter, we will never know. There is something in this that deserves to sit with you for a long moment before we move on. We have built an entire civilization on the assumption that we are the only kind of human being. Every religion, every philosophical system, every legal framework, all assume a single human nature, a single human dignity, a single category of being that is either fully human or not human at all. The world that the Red Deer Cave people lived in did not have that luxury. In their world, the boundary between human and other human was not theoretical. It was something you might encounter on the other side of a mountain range, in a valley you had never visited, around a fire that was not your fire. How did they understand each other? What did a Homo sapiens community in southern China 14,000 years ago think when they encountered people with different skull shapes, different facial architecture, different proportions, people who used fire and hunted deer and clearly lived intelligent lives, but who were visibly, recognizably, not quite the same? Did they trade with them? Did they avoid them? Did they fear them? Did they recognize in them something of themselves? We will never know. The encounter, if it happened, left no record we can read. But the question itself matters, because it tells us something about the nature of the solitude we now inhabit. We did not always live in a world with only one kind of human mind. For almost the entire span of our evolutionary history, another kind of mind was somewhere nearby, looking at the same world, reaching similar conclusions by different routes, or reaching entirely different conclusions. We may think differently because of them. We may dream differently. We may perceive the world through senses that were partly calibrated by evolutionary pressures that acted not on us, but on populations that we absorbed tens of thousands of years ago. The diversity inside us may be the echo of a diversity that once walked the earth in separate bodies. Let that rest. Let it drift. You don't need to hold it. Let it find its own place. The Toba catastrophe. 74,000 years ago, something happened that nearly ended everything. The Toba supervolcano on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia erupted. It was not merely a large eruption. It was the largest volcanic eruption in at least the last 2 million years, possibly the largest in the last 25 million years. The eruption ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma, a volume so staggering that no meaningful comparison exists in the experience of anyone reading these words. The ash cloud covered South Asia in a layer of volcanic material that in some places is still visible on the surface today, 74,000 years later, still lying there in the soil. A gray ghost of a catastrophe. The sulfur dioxide, ejected into the stratosphere, triggered a volcanic winter. Global temperatures dropped by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for several years. Some models suggest the cooling lasted for a decade or more. For populations already spread thin across the Eurasian landmass, already dependent on food sources that depended on warmth and light, this was existential. Genetic evidence from modern human populations suggests that immediately following the Toba eruption, the global population of Homo sapiens collapsed to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. Some estimates go as low as 1,000. 1,000 people. The entire human species, our entire lineage, every person who would ever live, every idea that would ever be thought in a human mind, every piece of art that would ever be made, every word that would ever be spoken or written or sung, reduced to a group that might fit in a single small town. For years or decades, that was all that remained of us. This event is called the Toba bottleneck. Its effects on genetic diversity are still visible in modern human genomes today. Compared to most other primate species, Homo sapiens shows remarkably low genetic diversity. The genetic difference between any two randomly selected humans from opposite ends of the Earth is smaller than the genetic difference between two gorillas living in the same forest. We are, genetically speaking, extraordinarily similar to each other, more similar than we often feel. We came within a few thousand individuals of not existing at all. Whatever we are, whatever extraordinary or terrible thing the human species has done and will do, it was almost not. We almost didn't make it past one catastrophic winter. That thought has a specific kind of weight. Feel it, then let it go. We are still here. The long disappearance. The disappearances happened over a wide span of time and across enormous geographic distances. Homo heidelbergensis disappears from the African record around 200,000 years ago. Homo naledi vanishes around 230,000 to 300,000 years ago. Homo erectus holds on in Java until roughly 117,000 years ago. Neanderthals disappear from Europe around 40,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis vanishes around 50,000 years ago. The pattern is not a single catastrophe. It is a progressive replacement, species by species, region by region, coinciding in almost every case with the arrival or expansion of Homo sapiens populations. Something about Homo sapiens was different, something that crossed a threshold that the other species had not quite crossed. Somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, in the lineage that would become us, something changed. The capacity for fully modern symbolic behavior, for language complex enough to transmit precise information across time and space, for art that encodes ideas rather than merely images, for social organization, sophisticated enough to maintain networks across hundreds of kilometers, for the accumulation of cultural knowledge across generations, seems to have reached a critical threshold. And then we were everywhere. And then the others were gone. We do not need to call it genocide to acknowledge that the correlation is real. The Neanderthals survived 300,000 years of ice ages. What they didn't survive was us. That is a weight we should carry lightly, as a fact, not a guilt, but we should carry it. The ghost population in Africa. There is one more piece of this story that almost nobody tells, not because it is hidden, but because it is still being assembled, piece by piece, from the genomes of living people. Within the genomes of some modern West African populations, researchers have detected stretches of DNA that show signals of introgression from an archaic human population. A population that has never been directly recovered from any fossil, but whose genetic signature is unmistakably present in living human genomes. They are called the ghost population. We don't know who they were. We don't know what they looked like or where they lived. We know only that they existed, that they interbred with the ancestors of modern West Africans at some point in the relatively recent past, and that they left behind a genetic legacy that is detectable today. The ghost population is a reminder that the story of archaic human diversity is not yet complete. Every genome we sequence, every cave we excavate, every ancient bone we find in a museum collection that no one thought to analyze with modern techniques, any of these might reveal a new lineage, a new chapter in the story of who was alive on this planet before the world contracted to a single species. The replacement that was not. The old model, the out-of-Africa replacement model, was clean and comfortable. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, spread across the world, replaced everyone else. That model is dead. When Pabo's team completed the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome in 2010, they found that people of European and Asian ancestry showed a higher genetic similarity to Neanderthals than people of sub-Saharan African ancestry. The difference was small in absolute terms, roughly 1.5 to 2.1%, but it was statistically unambiguous, and it had only one possible explanation. After Homo sapiens left Africa and before they dispersed into Europe and Asia, they encountered Neanderthals in the Middle East and interbred. The descendants of those mixed ancestry individuals then carried the Neanderthal DNA with them as they moved into Europe and Asia. The sub-Saharan African populations, whose ancestors never left Africa, carry essentially no Neanderthal DNA. The people whose ancestors did make that journey carry the genetic legacy of those encounters inside them right now. Inside you, perhaps, depending on where your ancestors walked. What we are not the survivors of a war between human species. We are the synthesis of them. Look at your hands, or imagine them in the dark, the familiar weight of your fingers resting against whatever surface holds you. Everything that makes you human, the ratio of your finger lengths, the sensitivity of your immune response, some of the variance in how you process pain, how you respond to pathogens, how your body behaves at altitude. All of this has been shaped by tens of thousands of years of genetic exchange with beings who were not quite you, who thought differently, who died differently, who looked at the same world through different eyes and understood it through minds that were like ours, but not ours. They are gone as populations, gone as cultures, gone as ways of being alive in the world, that we will never fully recover or understand, no matter how many bones we find or how many ancient genomes we sequence. The languages are gone, the stories are gone, the things they believed about death, about the sky, about the purpose of the mark a hand leaves on stone. All of it is gone, in a silence that no archaeology can break. But in the most literal and biological sense, they are still here. The Neanderthals live in the immune systems of Europeans and Asians. The Denisovans live in the high-altitude physiology of Tibetans and in the immune systems of Melanesians. The ghost population lives in the genomes of West Africans. And there are others, lineages we haven't named yet, signatures we haven't yet learned to read. The 9 species of humans who walked this earth are reduced to one, and that one carries all the others inside it. We are alone on this planet in a way that no previous human species ever was. For all of evolutionary history, for all of the long Pleistocene, for the vast majority of the time that anything recognizable as human has walked on 2 legs and looked up at the sky, there was always another kind of human somewhere, another population that looked almost like us, but not quite. That thought, almost like us, but not quite. That made the same tools, or different tools. That buried its dead, or didn't. That painted cave walls, or stared at them in darkness without leaving a mark. The solitude we feel now, the existential aloneness that runs through human philosophy and human religion and human art, the sense that we are somehow singular and isolated in a cosmos that does not share our nature, may have a component that is simply biological. We evolved in a world that always contained others of our kind, but not our species. We evolved to be aware of difference, to negotiate difference, to sometimes fight across difference, and sometimes to love across it. Our social instincts were shaped in a world where the stranger across the river might be genuinely, substantially different from us in ways that went deeper than language or custom. And then they were all gone, and we were left with only each other. And yet, and this is the thought to carry with you into sleep, we are not quite as alone as we sometimes feel, because inside us, in the chemistry of our cells, in the ancient sequences of our DNA, the others are still here. 40,000 years after the last Neanderthal fire went out in a cave in southern Europe, their DNA still shapes how some of us feel pain. 160,000 years after a Denisovan community lived at 3,400 meters on the Tibetan plateau, their genetic gift still lets their descendants' descendants breathe thin air. Pick up a stone, any stone. Somewhere in the world, there is a cave where the wall still bears the mark of a hand pressed against it 65,000 years ago. The hand of a Neanderthal. The pigment still red in the darkness. The outline still clear. That being looked at, the darkness of the cave, and decided to leave a mark. To say, in the oldest language there is, I was here, they were here, all of them were here, and in ways that biology is only now learning to read, they never entirely left. Let your breathing slow now. Let the story dissolve into the quiet dark around you. You don't need to hold any of it. It will still be true in the morning. The DNA will still be there in the morning. The evidence will still be in the caves and the fossils and the genomes, waiting patiently, the way ancient things always wait, without urgency, without need, without any sense that time is running out. Deep time has that quality, the patience of stone. You are the synthesis of everything that came before you. The immune system that fights off this winter's flu carries defenses shaped by Ice Age pathogens your Neanderthal ancestors faced in cold European forests. The mitochondria powering every thought you are having right now are descended in an unbroken maternal line from the first humans who left Africa, and from the archaic populations they met along the way, and from populations before that, stretching back past the origin of our genus into the deep past where all of life converges. You are not new, you are ancient beyond comprehension, carrying the condensed experience of billions of years of survival, of adaptation, of every catastrophe and bottleneck and lucky winter that the lineage of life on this planet has survived. Rest now. You carry enough history to last through the night. The fossils in their caves are still. The ancient DNA in its sequences is still. The Tibetan plateaus are cold and bright under their stars. The caves in Spain still hold their red handprints in the dark. And you are here, still here, after everything, still here,